Hello, everybody. We are beginning chapter 6 today, and this is a chapter that deals with the Renaissance. However, it deals only with the Renaissance in Italy. Interestingly, with your book, it actually goes by geography versus just time period. So we're going to go from the Renaissance to Italy, and chapter 7 will deal with the Baroque and the Rococo in Italy. And then we'll move on to chapter 8, which will go back to the Renaissance, but in other areas of Europe. So chronologically, your book does not move chronologically, but instead almost more thematically. So let's talk a little bit about Renaissance in Italy. So the great influence of the ancient Greek and Roman periods in all aspects of the culture were very, very influential here, including not only through architecture and design, but also art. However, what you will see is there will be no direct copies. Renaissance essentially means rebirth, meaning after the Middle Ages, and we'll be looking at the early Renaissance period, primarily works of the 15th century. So at this time, we're beginning to see more of a rise of the middle class, wealth, earning their money through their own efforts, and business, trade, and ways of making money this way rather than just making money inherited by the upper classes and through those generations before. We know that the people at this time supported the arts and literature. We also know that there was an increase of literacy, learning, and creativity during the Renaissance, and there was a renewed interest in literary works of antiquity. So then in general, guys, what you're going to see is a renewed interest in humanism that was very, very much in use during the ancient period. In general, humanism is a worldview that focuses on human beings. It's going to emphasize personal responsibility and a life dedicated to the common good and the end of individual nobility within the framework of Christianity. And again, guys, remember that Christianity is the primary religion that is practiced in Western and even Central Europe. Intellectuals and writers of this time fostered the concept of building a whole new culture on the foundations of classical learning. There was a desire to retrieve an ancient culture and its sophistication in all things: art, thinking, culture, architecture, and design. Architecture and design had the ability to reflect the people and the city's idea of itself. And what they wanted to project was an understanding that the people were upstanding, they were virtuous citizens, and again, they were in the greater good of the people. For structures, the ancient Greeks were concerned with the structure itself, and interior space was unimportant. So we're going back, let me say this again, we're going back to the ancient Greeks just for an understanding of what's going on with the interior design. For structures, the ancient Greeks were concerned with the structure itself, and interior space was unimportant. The Romans thought it unnecessary to coordinate the interior and exterior of a structure. So the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans were different. Again, let me say that again. The ancient Greeks were concerned with the structure itself, and interior space was unimportant. It's almost an afterthought. The Romans thought it unnecessary to coordinate the interior and exterior of a structure. Again, that's the ancient Romans. During the medieval periods, what we have seen is that the space was generally ill-defined, depending on how they wanted to use it. But, like I've kind of been priming you up and telling you that once we hit the Renaissance, interior design as we know it really begins to flourish. But during the Renaissance, the shape of interior spaces was usually as important as the exterior, and they were generally related to each other. So the shape of interior spaces was usually rectangular, and later on will include other shapes like polygonal shapes, squares, and even rounded interior spaces. However, rooms oftentimes opened from one into another. So instead of using hallways, they're going to simply have doors that lead directly into other rooms. Eventually, hallways will be introduced, and that will preclude the need to go through one room in order to get to another. And some of you might have been in apartments, even houses, where you go from one bedroom, you open up a door, and you walk through, and you're immediately in another bedroom. So as we know it, hallways that we know exist now do not really exist yet, even in the Renaissance. What we also see during this time is that floors oftentimes use tiles and are often made with clay, and while designs were still wet, carvings were made and color glazes applied to those tiles. Geometric shapes were very popular, including herringbone. In fact, herringbone shapes were very, very popular. Terrazzo was also popular, which was cement mixed with chips of marble that allow less expense. Mosaics remained popular as well. For upper stories of houses, wood was oftentimes used for floors, sometimes even brick. Walls were usually decorated with frescoes of patterns or illusionistic designs, and oftentimes walls were divided into 3 horizontal sections. The dado level, or the lower level, was oftentimes used for faux marble painting or even wood moldings. Sometimes you will actually see something that you and I now call wainscoting. The frescoes of illusionism, usually in the mid-level, so frescoes depicting outdoor scenes or frescoes of people, and the top level of walls will actually depict real or even painted moldings. Marble veneers were actually used on walls in more wealthy homes. Ceilings were oftentimes ornamented. Wood beams were oftentimes left plain with painted scenes in between them, and sometimes those beams were very elaborately carved and gilded. Brackets and corbels also became popular. Coffers, which we'll see later, as once I start showing you actual images, I know you're saying, where's the images? Coffers were oftentimes quite popular and sometimes very elaborate, and sometimes even gilded. Paintings on ceilings were oftentimes illusionistic, as looking into the heavens, it would either be painted a la fresco, like a fresco technique, or they would actually be painted on canvas and then put into place on the ceiling, actually installed onto the ceiling after they were painted vertically, so to speak. Ceiling to wall differentiation was at first marked with a cornice, or even just a square between the vertical wall and the, I shouldn't say square, but an actual 90-degree angle between the wall and the ceiling. But then eventually you will see more elaborate wood moldings used to mark the differentiation between the walls and the ceilings and where they meet. But sometimes you'll eventually see coving or even curved areas marking the difference between the wall and the ceiling. It is a gradual convergence rather than that 90-degree angle that you and I are all used to today. Fireplaces were still quite important, and as you know from the last lecture, chimneys are beginning to increase, and openings of those fireplaces in the walls were sometimes as high as 8 feet wide and even wider than the height itself. Furniture pieces, as you remember with the Gothic lecture, were increasing, but even more so now, and they begin to be more and more monumental, quite large for the time actually, but still quite a bit less than what we use today in terms of number of furniture pieces. And guys, here I am in my office, and I'm already looking, I have 3 chairs in my office. One is an office chair. One is a chair that I don't use to sit on because it was my great-grandmother's, and then I have the chair that I'm sitting in now. But I also count 1, 2, 3 tables, 1 desk, and 2 bookcases. This would have been a tremendous amount of furniture in a Renaissance interior. So just to let you know exactly what's going on. So let's look at the very first work on your list, and that is called the Palazzo Davanzati. It's beautiful, isn't it? And you can see that the Renaissance people, especially those of wealth, prefer to have a tremendous amount of decoration on their walls. So, general info on wealthy homes. Wealthy homes no longer needed defensive structures like castles, like what we saw in the Gothic period, because things are beginning to be more settled down. Oftentimes in wealthy homes, there are 3 or 4 more stories. In city dwellings, in rural areas, in the countryside, you will generally see 1 or 2 stories because they're able to expand further out on the land, having more of a footprint, so to speak, on the land. The ground floors were usually contained for service facilities, so where your servants might sleep. It also would contain your main entrance. It would also contain stables for your animals and your horses, and also storage areas. Then what you have what would be called, you and I would call the second floor. Then, and even in some European areas, it's still called the piano nobile or nobile. It contained decorated salons for formal occasions, sometimes bedrooms as well, and there would be oftentimes a private suite that contained a bedchamber and an outer private studio for the wealthy members of the family. Almost like the outer private studio would almost be like a study. And then it would have a closet-like space that served as a bathroom, but again, many of these structures do not have running water. Many, however, were built over a well that then might provide water through a pipe that might be connected from the lower floor, and then you can actually pump it up through the walls, which is very interesting, but that is not very often. The third floor was similar to the second, but with lower ceilings. And the fourth floor would actually be lower still, but with even more open spaces. So less a division of space into individual rooms and more open spaces. And that was usually reserved for living and sleeping quarters for servants because nobody wants to trudge up 4 floors, right? So even though today we think of the penthouse as being at the upper floors, that's because of this lovely thing called an elevator. Let's be real. And also it offers greater views of a city. But back then, even through the 19th century, oftentimes the poorer people were on the upper floors. Servants on the upper floors, certainly slaves on the upper floors. And then the lower floors were actually reserved, not the lowest, but the second and third floors were oftentimes maintained for the wealthy. Stairs would become more visible and even larger. Stairs were considered once to be very, very functional. However, as you guys know, when you walk into very, very large buildings, those stairs feature a prominent role and oftentimes are thought to be the most dramatic element. We're beginning to see that at this time, that our stairs are becoming more visible and larger and more dramatic. If you think about looking at homes of the wealthy or any kind of home that you see on HGTV, when people walk in and they have a great entryway and there's some wonderful grand staircase, people oftentimes go, ooh, ah, ooh. And that is beginning right around this time. Windows are beginning to move away from the stained glass windows that we saw as a preference for the Gothic ages and more of a preference for clear glass. And that way they are also demarcating themselves from those trends of the Middle Ages. However, interiors, you're going to see more ornament. Even fireplaces become ornamented with carved mantles, even more so before. And you can see the fireplace in the corner of this room here. As you can see, there is also a greater interest in rich colors throughout the interiors. And look at the walls here, goodness. Still few furniture pieces. Like I said, there's still not going to be that many furniture pieces, but they will become more ornamented and even more comfortable. More cushions will be used at this time. Woohoo, cushions. And beds oftentimes had canopies, as you can see here, and oftentimes were larger at this time. They will oftentimes contain a headboard, as you can see here, and sometimes even a footboard. Now, I will tell you that this image is the exact same image that's in your book. However, it does not have a canopy on the bed itself, but it is the exact same bed. Okay, so what we're going to see for hard surfaces, such as the floor, are oftentimes going to be made of tile, of marble, or brick, oftentimes in patterns, as you can see here. This is like a checkerboard pattern, and it is made of tile. Unlike medieval homes that were oftentimes not arranged with any particular plan or added on to consistently without any set standard in mind for the plan, Renaissance homes were very largely symmetrical. They were very ordered, they were very balanced, and they were very influenced by the classical period, that sense of logic and order to a space, which we really did not see that much in the medieval homes at all. Other elements were influenced by the classical period, such as moldings. You can see up here, there's almost a feeling of a dental molding in through here, okay? And also furniture designed by furniture makers at this time are oftentimes looking to Greek and Roman precedent because, again, they're looking to the ancient Greek and Roman period as the ideal. And tapestries were still used by the common industry, and they are beginning to be even more influential and then therefore more popular. And then therefore the tapestry making industry really greatly increases and they become very expensive in some situations, but then also more affordable to the wealthy, I should say the middle class. Remember too, like we talked about with the Gothic period, an artist will oftentimes be hired to create a cartoon, meaning a preparatory sketch for a particular tapestry, and then that will be sent to the tapestry weavers themselves in order to work out the design, make it more workable for a tapestry versus a painting, and then therefore it will then be made. When you're looking at these walls, these are actually painted, but what's interesting is that they have a tapestry-like feeling. So tapestries in general are still quite expensive, and even though this is certainly a wealthy household, painting the walls is actually going to be cheaper than using tapestries and far less warm, as you can imagine. So here what you're seeing here are actually wood beams in the ceiling, even though I do not give you a good example here. Again, guys, you can see the wood beams coming in through here, and these are actually brackets that are being used to hold them up. So these are actually functional, but they are also decorative. You can see the beautiful scroll or even volute pattern here. The wood beams themselves become, they're still very, very much exposed, like what we saw in the medieval period, but they are beginning to be more and more decorated. Like I said before, we have a tiled patterned floor. We have a canopy bed with ornamented finials. And usually you would also see drapes hanging from each corner of the bed. And then those drapes would then be closed during the evening hours, not only to offer privacy for when you and your husband might need some, but also from servants that might be bringing in food to you or checking on the lights or the candles, etc., lanterns or candles, and to maybe even check on the fireplace. However, those drapes were oftentimes also used not just for privacy, but to also keep in the warmth. Those tapestries, whether they be on the walls or the draperies on the canopy bed, were usually very brightly colored. And sometimes when you look at this, going back to the wall designs where tapestry were usually held, oftentimes the upper area of the wall paintings or even the tapestries themselves will oftentimes be illusionistic. So when you look through here, what you see is actually a feeling of it being an arcade, and each arcade ends with a small pillar. And then we almost see beyond that arcade to an area that, even though there is an orange wall here, we see trees and we see women doing their thing in through here. So it's almost as if the top of the wall actually ends right through here. Notice that there's a feeling of a painted molding to make it look like the wall ends here, and that this entire area is just open up to the exterior. Very illusionistic. Furniture is still quite basic, but ornamented. And that is what you will normally see with a Renaissance type domestic room that you see here. So let's give you a few significances, please. Is that furniture is still basic, but more ornamented. Furniture is more basic, is still quite basic actually, but more ornamented, okay? So in other words, not a lot of furniture pieces. You're still not going to have a lot of furniture in your room, but it's going to be more ornamented, okay? Another significance, please, is that canopy beds were common. And again, we're talking about for the wealthy interior, okay? Canopy beds were still pretty common. Another significance, please, is that walls were usually decorated and illusionistic. All right, there we go. That is how you spell illusionistic. In other words, it creates a sense of an illusion of there actually being the wall only up to about right here, and that up above it has a feeling as if the walls of the room have gone away and that you can actually see outside. So highly illusionistic wall coverings. Let's go on a little bit further here, is that wood beamed ceilings are still popular, but more ornamented. Wood beam ceilings, still popular, but more ornamented. And here's another view of that room here, guys. And again, you see more of those wood beams here, very evident here, okay? But as you can see, those brackets are very ornamented, and even the moldings on the wood beams themselves, much fancier than what we saw in the Middle Ages. In fact, in some areas with the Middle Ages, they were just very, very basic. Very, very basic. All right, so another significance, please, is it an example of a wealthy Renaissance household? Again, this is an example of a wealthy Renaissance household. All right, and you guys can see that the JPEG is much less quality here, but it allows you to see a little bit more of that wood beam ceiling. All right, let's move on. So this is the exterior view of it on the right, interesting, right? And it gives you an idea of a simple room inside the structure itself here, more probably for working ideas. This is probably a kitchen, even though I've never been in the structure before. Probably a kitchen, so in other words, used by servants. And notice too the wood beam ceiling here, not ornamented. But then when you look to the upper room here, another beautifully decorated room, that fireplace is quite large. The chimney is certainly decorated, as you can see here. And what's interesting here is when you guys look up and through here, see those curved lines here? Okay, those actually are illusionistic because it actually makes it look, even though my ink here is red, it actually looks like tapestry is actually hanging on the walls, but in fact it's painted. So again, quite illusionistic. And then you look at the furniture, and again, it's quite simple, but more ornamented. And you and I would choose to put all kinds of furniture in there, but it's quite simple here. On the exterior, what you will see here that will also become quite popular are what are called cartouches. Cartouches is something that's a decorative element that will oftentimes contain some type of symbolic meaning. And what we know here is that it is some type of family crest. Some type of family crest. So it would have marked that particular building as belonging to the Davanzati family. All right, let's move on. So the next on your list is a church, and it is called San Lorenzo. San Lorenzo. And when you're looking at this particular structure, your book focuses particularly on the nave. Now, just as a reminder, let me use my pen here. This area right here is the nave. Remember that aisles are over here and here. Back through this rounded area is the apse, and it would have contained the altar. But this frontal portion where the photographer is standing right here is the nave, and this is what your book wants us to focus on. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about why this particular building is also important. So around 1420 is when Florence saw its first Renaissance buildings being constructed, and this is located in Florence. And essentially, guys, with churches in the Renaissance period, what you're going to see is a return towards logical and mathematical ordering of space, like what we saw with ancient Greek and ancient Roman structures, versus the excessive amount of ornamentation that you saw through the Middle Ages, culminating in the Gothic period. So they are going to be, in the Renaissance period, more of a rational structural approach based on mathematics and science, forms and systems, believed to have been used in antiquity. All parts of the building should be in harmony with the others, just like the ancient Romans and Greeks did it, and oftentimes based on equality based on mathematical ratios. Brunelleschi was the man responsible for the introduction of this kind of scientific rationalism into his architectural practice and the design of his buildings. He was considered for many centuries as the father of Renaissance architecture. Not only was he an architect, he was also a designer, a sculptor, and a goldsmith. And he was the first Renaissance artist to be the subject of a full-scale biography, if you're interested. He had a talent for mechanical engineering, statics, hydraulics, and even mathematics. He is also credited for developing what we know of today as linear perspective. In fact, he not only used it in his architectural planning, he is also thought to help bring it to painting today, which is how you probably all know it, through drawing and painting with linear perspective, which was also so influential to Renaissance artists. And if you know about the person who perfected linear perspective in painting, it was a man named Masaccio. So, with this particular structure, there was a ruling family in Florence, and they were known as the Medici family, M-E-D-I-C-I. Every now and then you'll hear it pronounced Medici, okay? Giovanni de' Medici, or Giovanni de' Medici, was the patriarch of Florence's ruling family, again, the Medici, and he actually commissioned Brunelleschi to build a sacristy for the Medici parish church of San Lorenzo. Once he gets done with that, then he actually begins to develop the interior that you see here. So what he's doing here is creating a very, very mathematically rational space. What do I mean by that? Not to be confusing here, guys. So let me go to the plan here, and then I'm going to come back to the interior spaces a little bit more. So let's look at the plan. So this is the elevation here. If we were to cut that building from the top to the bottom in the center where the dome is, that's what it would look like. However, I'm going to focus more on the plan. Okay, so let's go to the larger area of the plan itself. Remember that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans very much used mathematics to essentially devise their buildings with mathematical ratios. You might remember that the ancient Greek architecture architectural temples used a ratio of 2 to 1, and we are seeing that mathematical ordering of space being used by Brunelleschi. So let me go on a little bit more from here and tell you exactly how he ordered out his space. So he is going to use one basic measuring system. And that is going to be the crossing square that you see right here. And he's going to use the measurement of this square in order to build the rest of the building. Now, if you take that square here, it is repeated in the apse. Notice that the apse is squared. That recalls ancient Roman basilicas, not Christian basilicas. And then you will take that and order it all the way down the space that you see here. Okay, so then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 of those particular measurements. And then you take the aisle, each aisle section of each little vault that you see here is 1/4 to that of the original crossing square mathematical ratio. Take that crossing square again and double it, and now you have your transepts. Okay, so it is a very, very architectural mathematical approach. And notice too, even with the baptistry here, it is the same size of the main crossing square ratio. So significance, please, is that it has a mathematical ordering of space. Mathematical ordering of space. Mathematical ordering of space. Now, let's go a little bit further here. It is also, as you already know, highly influenced by the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Notice that we are not seeing a post and lintel construction. We are seeing a rounded arch construction, and these rounded arches actually terminate in columns. Okay, so the use of arcades, arcade being a long row of rounded arches, is very, very ancient Roman. Notice too that even though he's using groin vaults here, groin vaults were not a medieval invention. They were actually an ancient Roman invention. And to go a little bit further here, what's also interesting is that we do not have a barrel vault here. Now, even though the Romans did use barrel vaults, you guys can see that the wall comes up and then the ceiling is flat. Now, that is something that was very common for ancient Roman temples. And each little square that you see here, that is called a coffer. A coffer, not like okay, you guys might remember we talked about coffers when we talked about the Pantheon. A coffer is a square that is oftentimes ornamental, but oftentimes also removes weight from a particular structure like the ceiling that you see here. Those coffers are also dating back to the ancient Roman period. So I would like you to know for another significance, please, is influence of antiquity, or you can say influence of the ancient Roman and Greek period. Or even ancient, or even you can even say influence of the classical period. Antiquity, the word that you see here, is very, very much equated to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and even the classical period. The Romans, however, did not top their columns with arcades, so this is a little bit different. The Romans would have just simply continued on with a post and lintel system rather than arcades. So that is more of a modern interpretation of how to use those arcades. So a little bit different here. So San Lorenzo is quite cool. Now also too, what you're seeing here is not the excessive ornament that you saw in the Gothic period where everything seemed to be covered. Instead, we see definitely a lot of decoration, but it's reserved, it's more tasteful, and it very, very much falls into place with the structure itself rather than literally taking over everything. In fact, you guys already know this, we've talked about this before, when you see a structure that uses several different colors at once on the interior and the exterior, like for instance this darker stone versus the lighter area here, that is called polychromy. And we know that the ancient Romans used it. I'm going to write it down for you. The ancient Romans used it not only on their domestic spaces, but in some cases also in their public spaces. And when I show you a closer interior space that you see here, this is right underneath the dome, you can see here he's using blue and cream here as well. And that interplay between the two, guys, is something that is meant to lend an air of decoration as well. So this is the exterior view of it, as you guys can see here, okay? And an interior view. But then also here, what you're looking at is again the use of polychromy. So another significance I'd like you to know is that the interior uses polychromy. Interior uses polychromy. And by the way, the other two pictures that I showed you were not of not specifically of the Church of San Lorenzo, but the larger complex of San Lorenzo. Again, ornament is very reserved, very, very much held back. Even though we do see a lot of ornament, it makes sense. It's not excessive like what we saw with the Gothic period structures. Next on your list is a work that was created by a man named Michelozzo di Bartolomeo, and this is called the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. The date on this is approximately 1444, and what you're looking at here is the open loggia of the, or the open, shall we say, garden area, the open area that you would oftentimes find in the middle of a Renaissance house. And this also is very, very typical of an ancient Roman structure, if you remember us talking about this before. So Bartolomeo here is showing the main open courtyard of a very rich household that was owned by the Medici family, okay? And what you're seeing him use here is very heavy, largely rusticated stonework and smaller windows. So large stones being used here to create the structure. You can see those here, and also smaller windows. But again, it shows an interest in the ancient Roman period. We see groin vaults in the covered areas, okay? And then of course we see rounded arches, even though you already know that Romans did not use a rounded arch that would terminate in a column, okay? And instead it would be a very large wall that would continue on, okay? But it still shows a heavy influence of the ancient Romans, because your main entrance is where we are standing, where the photographer is, and you'd walk into a small covered area, and then you would be able to see this large open area. It's very, very much influenced by ancient Roman domestic structures. So that is your first significance, please. Influence of an ancient Roman household. Influence of an ancient Roman household. And again, you might remember with the ancient Roman discussion that we had not that long ago. It wasn't that long ago. They oftentimes would include an interior open courtyard to not only get a sense of being outside where they could have lush plants and be able to get fresh air, but also it will allow them to be outside without having to commune with the rest of the people, the non-royals outside of the house. It also has a largely symmetrical plan, and Bartolomeo actually shows, unfortunately, a lack of full knowledge of ancient Roman methods because of the odd way he concluded the corners of the courtyard columns. As you see, these columns are actually quite large, and they continue with that size all the way around. However, what you have are these areas here that are actually quite wide where the rounded arches meet the columns. However, when you see this area right here on the corners, that area becomes very odd and narrow, and you can see how actually there is no room for any more of the molding that you would see in through this area. It does not exist right here. So it shows his not amateur quality, but just his lack of knowledge of the way that ancient Romans would take two colonnades or even arcades and how they would terminate into one another. It shows that lack of knowledge. So I'm going to make that a significance in just a second. Your book actually says there's this awkward collision between both rows of columns where those arcades meet or where those rounded arches meet. And I would agree with that. It looks just a little bit too delicate versus in through here it looks very, very substantial. So it does show a lack of knowledge where those two colonnades meet or two arcades meet. So I would like you to know that for significance, please. So it shows a lack of knowledge of how Romans intersected arcades. That's a long one, sorry guys. Shows a lack of knowledge of how ancient Romans intersected arcades. An arcade is essentially a row of arches. Okay, shows a lack of knowledge of how the ancient Romans intersected arcades. All right. Goodness, my spelling is, not my spelling is awful, but my handwriting is awful when I'm using this. All right, guys, I promise it's much better in person. Or on paper, I should say. All right. So let me show you a couple other views here. So when we come in, we're actually looking at the back of this sculpture. Let me show you another view that's a little bit closer up. Oftentimes you can see how large this is, guys, with the doors, and of course one of the tourists here. So these doors will then lead into the service areas of the house. Again, kitchens, think of storage areas, areas where they would keep their horses, etc., etc. But then you also have this beautiful decoration that might include not only family crests, and through here there's little sayings about the Medici family. Very, very important. And you guys also see this kind of swag of foliage here with these undulating ribbons that come out. So still very decorative. And also what you see here is a family crest. You see one over here as well. And the Medici are known for using a family crest that actually had a series of red balls. And depending on how many balls were in that family crest would then indicate what part of the family owned that particular structure. And when you go to Florence, you see them all over the place. And so when I was there last summer, I was constantly asking, okay, who does this one belong to? Who does that one belong to? So it's kind of fun to get all that knowledge. All right, let me show you a couple other images here. So this is an upper area of the room. Remember that the second level of the house, called the piano nobile, will actually, technically it would be nobile, I guess you would say in Italian, but this would be an area on this upper left-hand side where you would have gatherings and you'd show off your wonderful artwork and stucco work, and you can see it's just absolutely covered with gilding. I love that they used the ghost chairs here. I'm sure a lot of you know what the ghost chairs are, because it doesn't detract from the space, but then it also allows people to sit down. And obviously a place would be, somebody up here that would be talking. But this would be a place where you could have dances and gatherings, even political discussions. And you can see that it does have a barrel vault here. That is also very ancient Roman inspired. However, they would have hired the greatest artists to create these paintings on these ceilings. And remember, too, the excessive decoration that we see on the walls of Renaissance structures, despite the fact that furniture was quite simple. In fact, this painting that is on your upper right-hand side, that painting is actually talked about in your book. And to give you a sense of scale, again, we have two doors right here. So some of these wall paintings can get quite elaborate. And even, guys, as you look at the molding up here, look how elaborately done that is. This view here gives you another view of that courtyard. Again, this is a way to kind of impress your primary visitors, but then you would take them up to the upper areas because the lower areas, again, were meant for service. And more of a setting here that is a little bit more domestic. We are seeing a detail of that painting right here up above. But look at the tile work on the floor. Just absolutely exquisite. So we're definitely seeing more decoration here than what we would see, and on this room here, than what we saw on the entrance areas of the building itself. So very reserved on the entrance area. Notice again the use of polychromy here. And on the interior areas, we'll see a lot more gilding. So let's go back here, and if you haven't already written it down as a significance, please. Influence of ancient Roman domestic buildings. Influence of ancient Roman domestic buildings. I'm sure you already have that done. And also remember, too, that it shows that lack of full knowledge about how the ancient Romans would essentially terminate or intersect two arcades. All right. And with the interior of this structure, this is the open courtyard here, but with the interior structure, what you're seeing is very simple interiors in terms of the shapes of the rooms, but ornamented ceilings, ornamented moldings, and fireplace designs that just begin to be quite grand. So again, significance, please, is that we see a heavy level of ornamentation on the second floor. Heavy level of ornamentation on the second floor. Remember that the second floor was where you will be entertaining most of your guests. And interestingly, if you've ever been to Europe, especially in Western Europe, that first floor is not called the first floor. It's usually called the ground floor. And what we consider to be the second floor is actually what they call the first floor. So just to round up the ideas on the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, what we have here is a plan of a palace that is actually quite simple in nature, rectangular and symmetrical rooms. However, the rooms themselves are quite ornamented. We have ornamented ceilings, walls, moldings, floors, obviously, and fireplace mantles. So another significance I'd like you to know is despite the symmetrical plan, the ornamentation is high. Again, despite the symmetrical plan, ornamentation is high. And isn't it just gorgeous? Yeah, I'd like to live here myself. All right, thank you. So let's move on to your next work of art. And here's another view of the interior. Look at these. Now, even though I've talked about them before, I want to make sure that you guys know that these are called pilasters. They are not columns. They are not engaged columns. They come out only slightly from the wall and are rectangular in appearance. They don't come rounded out from the edge of the wall. They're rectangular. And even though we have a feeling of capitals, these are not truly supportive. These are purely decorative. And so those are called pilasters. And how you spell pilaster is Pilaster, pilaster. Okay, again, goodness, you're gonna hear me say this repeatedly because I'm embarrassed about my handwriting while I'm writing on my vertical computer screen with obviously my keyboard and everything else preventing me from getting a good writing here. So again, pilaster here. Not a significance. I just want you to be able to recognize that pilasters are decorative. They come out only slightly from the surface of the wall, usually rectangular in their relief, and they are more decorative than anything else. All right, let's move on. And just when I say I'm ready to move on, here is an exterior view of the facade of the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. You guys can see that on the lower level here, it's quite rusticated throughout the entire lower level. And as we move, rusticated meaning that the individual stones that you see here are very rusticated, very worn looking. They have a very ancient feeling to them. And that's quite purposeful. And then in the middle layer, that Piana Nobile again, notice that the stones are smaller and they are smoother, more sophisticated looking. And then once we get to the third layer here, the third level here, notice how everything is smoothed down quite a bit. So you really have a hierarchy of scale moving from the lower levels to the upper levels. And notice too, we have that cartouche that is all about the Medici family and those little individual balls that you see on the lower level there. However, one thing that's quite interesting about the facade of the Palazzo Medici Riccardi is the extreme cornice that you see. This area here, that cornice is very, very large. Notice that the dentil molding itself, less of a dental molding and more of a bracket. This is actually more of a series of brackets, I should say. This is the secondary lower area is more of a dental molding. Definitely has its origins in ancient Rome. However, that cornice being very, very large is not typical of the of antiquity. It is very, very much meant to give great ornament and a frame, so to speak, for the structure. However, more than anything, is if I go back to this area, what you can see is that it actually provides a bit of a sunshade for the upper layer of the structure itself, which is obviously going to maintain the most heat of the structure. So it actually has a twofold purpose. All right, so this is the exterior. Now, goodness, let's move on to the next one. Yes, and of course, I have yet another one for the Medici Riccardi. Goodness, guys. We're going to linger on with this structure forever. Notice that if I were to vertically cut this in half and even horizontally cut it in half, it is primarily symmetrical in plan. Yes, you have some interior staircases here. Those would have been more prominent than in the medieval period. But then you also have a spiral staircase, which is more for the working areas of the house. But again, you have that interior courtyard here that we've seen before, very common of ancient Roman houses, even though we're in the Renaissance now. But again, that plan is very symmetrical. Notice the lack of hallways, something that you and I are very used to. Lack of hallways here, but those will eventually come in. All right, everyone. So we are finally moving on to our next image and or our next interior design photograph here. And what you're looking at is the studiolo, excuse me, for the Ducal Palace that is located in Gubbio. It's an area that is not far away from Florence in Italy. The date on this is approximately 1470, and this was actually created for a man named Federico da Montefeltro, who was the Duke of Urbino, also not far away from Gubbio. And the Duke of Urbino, Federico da Montefeltro at the time, was, if for those of you that attended my 106 class, he is the guy that had half of his nose and his right eye missing. If you don't know the story, he's a very, when he's depicted in art before the accident, oftentimes shown from the front. After the accident, usually shown from his left-hand side. He was actually participating in a jousting tournament, and he was hit, unfortunately, and his large chunk of the bridge of his nose as well as his right eye was taken out, unfortunately. But he continued to live, and you'll see very interesting pictures of him. That's Federico da Montefeltro. So this is what it was actually made for. It was made for the Duke of Urbino at the time. And let's go ahead and know that for significance, please. It was made for the Duke of Urbino. And let me spell out his name for you. Maybe if my pen decided to cooperate. Oh, goodness. Urbino. Again, made for the Duke of Urbino. And Urbino is a town that is just slightly northwest of Florence in Italy. So as you know, floor patterns as well. You guys can see the beautiful patterning of the floor here with tile. However, ornament on the walls becomes very, very popular, and they begin to cover all wall surfaces. Goodness, becoming very, very popular at this time. And what you're looking at here is a type of decoration, and I'm talking about not the paintings, guys, but just here and below. Okay, this is called intarsia. And I'm going to spell it for you so you know how to spell it. Intarsia is actually a technique that uses inlays of wood to create illusionary scenes. And these were incredibly elaborate and incredibly filled with time in order to get them done, but they are illusionistic. For instance, when you look right through here, it looks as if there is a cabinet down here and one of the doors has been left open. That is incorrect. They are simply a flat piece of wood inlay. Even when you look in through here, it feels as if you have little brackets that come out towards you. In fact, that is not true. It's just wood inlay that's very flat, and it looks like little shelves on which objects have been placed. Again, that is completely illusionary, and it looks like little cabinets have been opened up here with little doors coming out to you and shelves with items on them. Again, I have to tell you, that is all wood inlay. It's highly illusionistic. Let me show you some other images here. And of course, we have all kinds of images of dukes right above us here. So sorry for the relatively bad JPEG here, but I'm going to give you an idea. So again, keep in mind that all of this is flat. You are not actually seeing anything coming up and away from the wall. It's all flat. So they're using linear perspective, which, as you already know, was invented by Brunelleschi, because we talked about that earlier on in the discussion. But what you see over here to the right is what looks like a lamp on a pedestal, but in fact electric lamps have not been created yet, as you know. Looks like a book is leaning up against the lamp, and then you have an area that looks as if it comes out and away from the structure, but in fact this is all flat. I love how in this section here you have an area that looks like it is actually filled with two pilasters here, and that we have almost a feeling of it being a covered porch, and then arches and arcades that then lead out to an entire city that we can see through here. Love the little squirrel that's come to rest on the ledge here, but it is incredibly illusionistic and it looks incredibly real. It's one of those things where you just want to take the time to really look at it. I was able to be there last year. In an actual studiolo, not this studiolo, but in another studiolo, and the intarsia designs are absolutely amazing to look at. You just can't believe the level of skill, and we're talking about very thin layers of wood that are painted, not painted, but stained different colors, and of course different kinds of wood as well, prized for their color, but also prized for their wood grain, etc., etc. And they are just beautifully, beautifully done. I love how you can see up in this section here an hourglass and weapons and what looks like books and candles. Down here it looks like you're seeing some type of almost like an organ, even though organs have not been invented as we know them yet, but definitely pipes, some type of here some type of cartography making tools, and even some type of globe or some type of tool to look at the heavenly bodies, so to speak, and the movement of them. Again, with the feeling of little bits of cabinet doors that are left open. Okay, so it looks in a funny way kind of messy because no one has closed those doors yet. And then look at this area here. Again, how you have a feeling of a bench that comes out and away from the wall. But in fact, it is all illusionistic. I think they're just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So this is the Studiolo. It was actually taken apart and is now located in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm not exactly sure why it was taken apart, but what we do know is that they were able to save these pieces. I'm not sure if the structure itself was in disrepair, but they were able to save these pieces and actually put them into the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was incredible. So significance, please. I would like you to know that it involves incredible skill and engineering. Okay, incredible skill and engineering. It just is an amazing piece, and to be able to not only design it, but then engineer all of these veneers and then put them in place the way they are is absolutely magnificent. By the way, the floor that you see here that is tiled, that is actually painted tile, which is interesting in this particular area. And then up above, even though you don't see them here, here you actually see images of dukes. So it's very much, in a way, propaganda for the dukes themselves. But, and I'm going to rewrite that I right here. Another significance I'd like you to know is that the Intarsia technique is highly illusionistic, and I'll spell that for you. The Intarsia technique is highly illusionistic. Intarsia is the use of those wood veneers in order to create highly illusionistic scenes, whether there be three-dimensional animals or city scenes, or even a feeling of sculptures like what you see here, benches that come out, cabinet doors that are open, just incredibly illusionistic. And what you see here more than anything, not only is it illusionistic, but it actually fools your eye into thinking things that thinking that you're seeing things that aren't actually there. And this is called, it's a very specific term, and it is a French term that means to fool the eye. It's spelled trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil, and trompe, the term trompe itself literally means to fool, and the L that you see here is the abbreviation of the word the, and oya literally means eye. So to fool the eye is a term that is oftentimes used with artwork such as this. All right, guys, questions before we go any further? Questions before we go any further? All right, good. Then let's go on. And let me see if there's any other images before I commit to saying that we're moving on to your next image, okay? All right. So do I have others? I do not. So then let's go on to your next image, which is called the Sala dei Gigante. Gigante. And it is located in a room, larger building known as the Palazzo del Te. Now, if you've taken my architecture class, you might remember this structure. And instead of the structure itself that we're going to focus on, we're going to focus specifically on this room. Remember that illusionism is going to become very, very popular as we see Brunelleschi developing linear perspective. And linear perspective is going to be used in many areas, such as in the room with the Intarsia, the inlays here, the Studiolo. But then what's also interesting here is that here with this particular piece, less about linear perspective and more about illusionistic wall painting, just in terms of three-dimensional spaces and the effect that it gives. So this structure was actually designed by a man named Giulio Romano, And he not only is an architect, but he is also a painter as well. I'm going to show you the outside of the structure itself first before we go any further. This is the outside of the structure as you move into the courtyard. And even though you don't know a whole lot about architecture, unless you've taken it with me before or know a decent amount about it before you came to the class, you might remember the Doric style of architecture in the ancient Greek and Greek period specifically, that it used triglyphs and metopes. Romano is someone who's known for his level of theatricality, and when you have a knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman architectural styles and architectural techniques, what becomes very, very clear to us when looking at this is that Romano is playing with our head a little bit. He's actually creating a visual and architectural joke, if that makes sense. So when we look at this, we know that when we look right through here, one of those metopes is missing, and one is missing here as well. That was actually done on purpose because it's Romano's way of playing with the people who owned this structure in order to create almost like, quite honestly, almost like a Disneyland, if that makes sense. Not with rides, but with things that are very, very visually interesting and appealing. And it would have been a little bit of a joke like, oh, where are those metopes? And then we would also look at the areas such as this, and you see a couple on the other side as well, where the triglyphs have actually slipped from their place. It doesn't make sense. It's fun. And then we also know that when you see a rounded arch, like what you see here, we do not need to have a pediment over it because that rounded arch will actually deal better with weight thrust than the pediment itself. And then therefore also, we also see in that rounded arch, again right in through here, that those individual voussoirs are not in fact individual stones at all, that they are stamped concrete. So it begins to be a little bit of a joke. To go a little further here, when we look at these stones, also stamped concrete, there's too much mortar between them. You look at throughout this area, too much mortar between them. That's because there is no mortar between them, and so we know that that structure would not exist if there was that much mortar between them, because it's the stones that add the strength. The mortar just binds them together in a very strength kind of way, or minimal strength kind of way. So, and then if we look up and through here, we also see a keystone higher than the rest, but then those voussoirs don't go over the edge at all. In fact, there is no need for a voussoir if you have a pediment up above. So again, just strange and doesn't make sense. Even in the niches, there's nothing here. So it's just an odd assortment of things with this structure. Now, this structure actually began as a hunting lodge. I'm sorry, not a hunting lodge. Horses involved, though. It actually began as a simple breeding lodge for horses. So they are known, this particular family, was actually known for breeding horses. But as they began to be more interested in visiting the outer areas of Italy, they began to expand that breeding lodge to an area that was essentially a stud farm, okay? But they began to expand it even more so they actually combine it with a bit of a country retreat. And a country palace is actually called a villa, V-I-L-L-A. And this is what it actually ended up becoming more of, was more of a stud farm combined with a villa, so it was slowly added on to. So then when we come to the area that is the most well-known, and certainly what your book wants us to focus on, is the painting of the Sala del Gigante, which literally means the room of the giants. So what this depicts is actually a time when the giants, who were mortal creatures, not humans, but giants, actually decided to challenge the Titans, the ancient Greek Titans, to control over the earth. And so the giants said, bring it on, we're going to battle you for control of the earth. And of course, the giants were given a big beat down. It is also called the Gigantomachy, if you know the ancient Greek versions. And you saw that several times if you took the 105 class with me, and I'm sure you've heard about it several times as well. It's actually depicted on the Parthenon. But so then what we see is this very, very dramatic view of this painting on this room of the battle between the Titans and the giants. And you can see how chill the Titans are up here, but this war that's waging between the other Titans and the giants down below. You can see columns that are actually falling down. You can see the arcades that are being broken up. The voussoirs are coming apart and they're just falling down. You see a high degree of high degree of a drama here. You see dead giants, you see people in the midst of being killed, and these stones are just falling apart. Now, in terms of size, guys, these are the doors, and so you and I are going to hit right about here. These doors are actually quite large. To add to this dramatic feeling, notice the floor. The floor is actually is terrazzo, and it's actually a very, very heavily swirling floor that adds to this swirling movement within the painting itself and within the room itself. Here's another view for you, and again, that swirling floor that your book doesn't really pay that much attention to, which is kind of sad, but that swirling floor adds to this sense of theatricality and drama in this scene. And then as we look up to the ceiling, we see, again, the Titans being, in general, kind of chill, okay? But some of them getting ready to give a beat down, so to speak. But what's also interesting is that we have a feeling of a rounded colonnade, as you see right in through here, a rounded colonnade, and then a domed ceiling with actually coffers in it, which I think is quite interesting. So the whole room is meant to be very dramatic. It's meant to be very theatrical. And this is something that we're going to see as we move towards the Baroque period, more and more and more, this love for theatricality and drama. So that is your first significance, please, is that the mural shows a love for theatricality and drama. The room shows a love for theatricality and drama. Another significance, please, is that it's highly illusionistic. Notice, too, that there's no straight lines between where the walls end and where the ceiling begins. They've taken the walls and actually curved them as they meet towards the ceiling, which adds to that level. So again, another significance, if you already don't have it, if you have it written down, that's great, sorry. It's highly illusionistic. So it feels like the physical building, the actual building of the Palazzo del Te that we are in, is actually being torn down by the giants. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful, expressive painting. However, what adds to this is that the doors themselves don't detract from the view that much, because the doors themselves are painted to work in with the scene. You can see it in through here. But what's also interesting, guys, is there are no windows to take away that illusion. So again, another significance, good design, is that they do not have windows to spoil the illusion. Okay, there are no windows. Again, significance, please. No windows to spoil the illusion. I think it's pretty sweet. Pretty sweet. And it goes, again, shows that love of decoration, even though it's a simple room in terms of plan. It's a very dramatic and highly ornamented room in terms of the wall. All right, let's move on. Yeah, it's a fun building. Really fun. All right, so let's move on to the next work. And this is called let me make sure I can say it correctly, the Sala Belviacqua, I should say. And it is located in the Fondazione Bagatti Valsecchi. And this is yet another palace. The date on this is about 1500. It is very luxurious and elegant. And again, shows, these very simple plans, simple interior plans, simple rooms, but highly, highly ornamented in terms of its treatment. Look at the fireplace here. So we have a fresco on the fireplace itself depicting cherubs, and then the mantelpiece is actually quite gorgeous, and you see carving of the fireplace itself, and the fireplace is also quite large. And then you also see, and we're going to see this later, this reference to this chair right here, which we'll talk about shortly. It's called a Savonarola chair. We'll talk about that shortly. And then we see the tremendous amount of decorative touches to the ceiling. You guys can see with those squares, those are called coffers. And of course, we have these gorgeous moldings in through here that are clearly gilded. Even just the doorways are incredibly gilded as well. It is a very luxurious and elegant interior. The patterning that you see on the walls are actually silk-covered walls, patterned first and then placed on the walls themselves. And let me go on a little bit further here. I want to show you a detail here so you can see a little bit more of that. Again, the tiled floors, gilding everywhere. Gilding, again, remember that gilding essentially means the application of very thin sheets of gold. Sometimes you'll see them use metal. It's going to be use silver. And we have highly ornamental moldings. The chimney and the mantelpiece also gilded. In terms of the furniture that we see here, we see a Savonarola chair, which I've already marked out towards you. That is actually on your list. In fact, we're going to talk about those in 2 more images. Then we also see a simple Savonarola chair here as well, but without a back like what we see right here. We also see a cassone. A cassone is a simple chest. You'll see that here, but they begin to be quite decorated once we move into the later areas, and sometimes we will see cassone actually being doubled as what you see here. But I'm going to erase my ink because I'm going to show you this chair. You can kind of see it here. It has a back like this and a simple area that comes out like this. Okay, that is actually called a casapanca. A casapanca. Oh, I'm sorry. I am totally wrong. It is not called a casapanca. The casapanca, what you're seeing here is a scabello chair. A scabello chair, which is a lower seat on the right that has an elevated back. Okay, so the casapanca is actually right here, and that is actually a feeling of a bench or a chest with a raised back. So I will spell these out for you if you're interested. Okay, so Savonarola is actually on your list. Cassone is also on your list. However, what you're looking right here is called a casapanca. Casapanca, okay. And then this chair right here, which you'll see again in a moment, is a scabello. And you have to say it with that Italian accent, okay. Scabello. And again, my pen stopped working, guys. Give me just a second here. Ska, and that is an A there. Sorry, it's not working. There we go. Scabello. Scabello. All right. So what we're beginning to see, as you guys can see, is a growing preference for chairs versus stools or benches. So we're beginning to see that more and more in the Renaissance period. So I would like you to know that for significance, please, okay, is that we're seeing a growing preference for chairs versus stools or benches. Growing preference for chairs versus stools or benches. I would also like you to know that the wall coverings are made of silk. Wall coverings made of silk. Yet another significance, please. Very luxurious and elegant interior. Very luxurious and elegant interior. By the way, in terms of the fresco that you see on the chimneys, you already know that chimneys are beginning to be more and more decorated. And what you see here are actually what you and I would call cupids, okay? But in fact, there is only one cupid, so to speak, according to the Greek and Romans, and that was the son of Venus or Aphrodite, depending on if you're looking at Roman or Greek. But the Italian called them putti, P-U-T-T-I. And so you see the Italian cupids, the Italian putti here. And even though that's a nod to essentially the ancient Greeks and Romans, at the same time, once they are Christianized, so to speak, they are called putti. And again, you and I would call them, you know, little angels, all right? So, but again, when we see cupids with a Christian definition, they are called putti, which I think is interesting. Isn't it just gorgeous? Just amazing. I'm not even sure I could even get tired of looking at everything. I guess I could after a while, but it would take me a long time. Let me erase this little mark right here before I move on. Okay, here is another room in that house. Again, the tables are still relatively plain, almost like trestle tables, but you can begin to see more and more decoration on the furniture. Even the lovely wood that you're seeing here, again, the wood that's being used is depending on what's native in that particular area. You guys can see I clearly got it off of a website with the watermark that you see down below, but look at those wall coverings. And again, they look like tapestries, but in fact, these are silk. You have little sayings above, oftentimes Christian sayings, or how you should be a moral, upstanding person. And here is yet another view of this room, or not this room, but of this house. Again, look at the fireplace, and look at the Savonarola chair. It's just absolutely massive here towards the left of the fireplace. And then you see the stairways. Those stairways, as we talked about before, are becoming more and more elaborate as time moves on. And again, it's still a relatively simple room, but the decoration of it is what has become so incredibly ornamented. So now we're moving on to the Cassone, and this is painted by Giovanni Francesco Toscani. And the date on this is approximately, we have no specific date, but it was made in the 15th century. Now I want to make sure that you guys know that this is the exact same Cassone that is located in your book. However, with the photograph that was taken of it, I do not have a tremendously high JPEG. I will try to get a larger one of you for you when we see a detail. But you can see there's gilding on it. You can see that there's images of people on the right and left far sides. You can see the wooden top and the wooden bottom. However, the area that you see in through here, guys, is just a wall covering that it was placed up next to. So that is actually not part of the Cassone itself. So as you know, a cassone, I've already told you, is actually a wooden chest. However, it will always have a lid on it as well. So a cassone can be something quite simple, like what you saw here, okay? It can be quite simple, but as you already know, they become quite elaborate as well and even begin to have feet on them, as what you see right here. So let me go back for a second. And believe it or not, when I was doing my master's degree, I actually did an entire paper on cassone, so I actually know a decent amount about them. Walnut was the preferred wood for furniture at this time in this particular area, and because walnut is also still today considered quite a strong wood, it here is not so elaborately carved, but many cassone actually become very, very elaborately carved. And because it is gilded and because it is painted upon, obviously that takes time and money, especially if you're hiring a well-known artist. So then therefore, when you see these cassones that go beyond just a simple wooden box chest with a lid, they begin to be symbols of wealth. Let me show you a couple other examples, and we'll come back to this in a second. But here are a couple more elaborate examples, and aren't they absolutely gorgeous? They could be a simple chest, but like I said, they could be quite elaborate as what you see, and then they begin to be doubled like what the one that you see on the upper right. However, most cassone, when they begin to be quite decorated like this, are usually used to hold a dowry. Now, a dowry is something that you and I do not use the idea of anymore, but even in the 50s, there was a time during my parents' generation that a woman might get a hope chest, and she would fill it with things that she hoped to use when she was married, and it became a chest to store things looking forward to your adult life and of being a wife and a mother, which was a goal that a woman should have back then. But however, going back to the Renaissance, a dowry was used, and a dowry is something that, depending on where you were, in what area you were in, and what time you were in, a dowry could be used by a woman that is then put together to help her become more desirable as a wife. And it was not only money, but also objects of wealth, items of wealth that would then be put into the box. And then because the box became symbolic of who she was and how wealthy her family was, then the box itself was quite elaborately adorned. However, the dowry could also be given in order to buy a wife, if that makes sense. So the groom's family could also create a dowry in order to attract a wife. So it depends on who's creating the dowry in what time they're creating the dowry and in what location. So, but these cassone actually begin to be very decorative. They become not only symbolic of the family's wealth, but they could also be used as a dowry. So let's go back to the one that you see here. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a significance here, is that when elaborately decorated, they're a symbol of wealth. When they are elaborately decorated, they are symbols of wealth. And by the way, they are usually used by the Italians, not much by the French, and not much by the Germans. Okay, so they're a very, very Italian innovation, and that's another significance, please, is that they are an Italian innovation, are used primarily by Italians. Another significance, please, is they were oftentimes used to hold a dowry. And I'm spelling dowry for you. Okay, oftentimes used to hold a dowry. And quite honestly, sometimes the chests themselves were painted with images of the couple or even their parents. And like I said, it's very, very similar to our hope chests that we think of today, but it's less about buying or selling a bride. All right, so then you might have, you can see a man and a woman here, and a man and a woman here, and oftentimes that will relate to both of the parents of the bride and the groom. And then when we see this clearly better reference here to the painted scene here, you see a building here that is a reference to polychromy, and you guys can see that. By the way, Florence had a polychromy cathedral. Interestingly here, we must have seen some type of union between Italians and French, because that is a French fleur-de-lis. You guys remember us talking about this before. A fleur-de-lis is a stylized lily flower, and it represents French royalty. But it's also illusionistic. You have a not so great interpretation of linear perspective, but the building that you see here is the artist is certainly trying to use that to create a feeling of the building receding in space. But then you also see women and men of the upper class with their nice clothing on, and the horses that are well decorated as well. So it becomes a scene perhaps of the city of where the bride and the groom will live. Unfortunately, I do not have any information other than the fact that we have a fleur-de-lis, and I should never erase that because I'm now going to make you know it again, is that the fleur-de-lis ties it to French royalty. Again, significance, please, is that the fleur-de-lis ties it to French royalty. Now we are going to move on to your next image, which is the Savonarola chair. The date on this is approximately 1500. Let me tell you that the one that is in your book, I literally searched the internet for so long to try to find that exact image, and I was not able to. And again, your book shows a black and white image, and I'd rather show it to you in color. So just make sure that you know that this is slightly different than the one that is in your book. So the Savonarola chair that is in your book actually dates to around 1500, but the chair itself, the style of it actually derives from ancient Roman sources. It was a very common style of chair, and it was known for its elaborate folding design. So even though you see this, the seat here is actually quite straight, you can see with the detail here that it's actually made of several different pieces of wood that then connect to the curved designs here, and then those curved designs continue on to this side, etc., as you guys can see, and then it folds up. Do I have a picture? I do not have a picture of it folded up, but as you can imagine, it folds up, okay? So it's an elaborate folding design. You can see a couple other versions here and how elaborate they become. The one that's in your book is actually relatively plain. So another significance, please, is that it has a elaborate folding design, okay? Has an elaborate folding design. So you can pick it up and take it with you, kind of like our camp chairs when we think of today, but I think much cooler than our camp chairs. All right, mine says like U of M on it or something like that. Not that I'm a sports fan at all, but it is what it is. I would also like you to know for significance, please, that it has the influence of the ancient Roman X-shaped seat, okay? Ancient Roman X-shaped seat. Very, very, very much tied to ancient Roman designs. The reason why it's called the Savonarola chair, it was thought to be the favorite type of chair of the priest whose name was Savonarola. And Savonarola, if you know anything about Savonarola, Savonarola was a very intelligent and very exuberant priest who was also quite conservative. And he is the one that warned people in Florence about the use of art and how art itself was becoming idolatrous. And he also believed that nudity in art was going to be something that was going to be very problematic and could relate to or could lead to the downfall of Florentine society. So, in fact, he really called for the expulsion of the Medici. He critically attacked artists who were using nudity, and the Medici family, who was the largest patron of art at the time. It's very much tied up with Michelangelo's sculpture of David, if you know that story. Unfortunately, Savonarola went too far on the conservative edge, and they ended up killing him and doing horrible things to his body. Goodness, why am I giving this whole story? But we know that this chair was named the Savonarola chair simply because it was his favorite style of seat. So, significance, please, is that it was named after the famous priest. Named after the famous priest. And yes, his name was Savonarola. All right, let's move on. So last on your list, and I do wish that your book would give you more examples, and I will in just a moment. This is a velvet cloth of gold. It was actually woven in Venice, and this dates to the late first century of the Renaissance, which was the 1400s. So it's dated to the late 15th century. So silk was actually the preferred textile for this time. However, velvet and damask were actually very popular too. And if you don't know how to spell damask or damask, you'll actually hear it pronounced like sometimes damask is usually what is more popular. Velvet and damask were also quite popular. What was also very, very popular, guys, was that they were going to use very, very large patterns with bold colors, sometimes of gold, as you can see here. And those styles were, and let me show you a little compendium here, a little collage of different styles and patterns that were popular this time. Florals and shields and foliage and crowns, symbols of wealth, fleur-de-lis, even animals were very popular. So, significance, please, is that gold embroidered textiles were popular. In fact, sometimes they weren't just embroidered, they were actually woven in. So they actually are tapestries that are actually woven in. So gold embroidered textiles were popular at this time. A lot of gold. You can see it in four of these. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 of them actually have gold in them, and maybe even a fifth, depending on how that color is transferring. And then when we look at this, also large patterns of foliage and florals become very, very popular. However, another significance I'd like you to know is that, velvet was a popular cloth at this time. Okay, velvet was a popular cloth for textiles. Okay. And what we're also seeing here is not only was velvet becoming popular, silk was still the preferred textile, but because it was, thought to come from a different kind of area of the world, et cetera, et cetera. But what we also see is that textiles are being used for more than just tapestries on the walls, but they're actually beginning to be used for cushions, bedding, and wall coverings, and even curtains. So that's another significance, please, is that textiles are being used for cushions, bedding, and drapery. So again, we're beginning to see textiles used for cushions, bedding, and drapery beyond just wall coverings that have been popular for a couple hundred years by this time. One last significance is large patterns were popular. Large patterns were popular, and you can see that here. Very rich colors. Rich coloring throughout the entire Renaissance. Very, very popular at this time. Venice, very much known for their textile design as well, if you're interested. All right, everybody, this now begins or ends our discussion for the Renaissance chapter dealing with the Renaissance in Italy. That is chapter 6. Thank you very much for listening.